I'm here with Dr. Daniel Haan, who is a professor here at Oxford. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background and what you currently do here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. So I'm a fellow at Campion Hall, which is the Jesuit college here at Oxford, and Blackfriars, which is where we're at right now. And my background was in medieval philosophy, and most of my graduate studies were in Thomas Aquinas at the Center for Thomistic Studies in Houston. And then I finished my degree in Leuven, and I worked on Avicenna's metaphysics. But then after my doctoral studies, I got a postdoc at the University of Cambridge, where I worked on more philosophical anthropology and the intersections with neuroscience and cognitive science in general. But I've always had a kind of interest in how these topics in anthropology and metaphysics brush up against issues in hylomorphism and evolution. So I've also kind of been working on that on the side, and those sort of topics have interested me for a long time. I came to Oxford in 2018 and with a postdoc at the Ian Ramsey Center, which is the Center for Science and Religion here in the Faculty of Theology. And then I started this post around 2021. So.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about the neuroscience as well, because my background's in neuroscience, actually.
Fantastic.
Yeah. But before we get into that, I came across your work because of ThomisticEvolution.org, which is a website I've been recommending to my students and to people who are generally interested in reconciling faith and reason around evolution for quite a while now. It's a great website. I've had Father Nicanor Austriaco come and speak at our university before. So tell me a little bit about your work with ThomisticEvolution.org, and maybe tell us a little bit about what is ThomisticEvolution.org.
Yeah, so it's a tremendous website, just like the Aquinas 101 episodes and all the things those Dominicans are doing. Really tremendous, helpful resources for people for entering in at a lot of levels. I mean, I consult these things, they're very helpful. With the Thomistic Evolution, I got involved with the project somewhere in the early days of COVID, when there was a volume of papers that they were starting to edit and put together. And that's now coming out with Catholic University of America Press sometime later this year, which is in 2024. So what it is a resource that's trying to address issues about the compatibility of the Catholic faith and the sciences, focused particularly on a lot of classic objections from various sources. A lot of them, though, tend to be kind of more Protestant ways of influencing Catholic thought. Early on, the Catholic Church didn't really actually have deep issues and disagreements with some of the claims that were made about evolution. They sought to try to find a way to reconcile the two of them. There have been extreme philosophical claims that have been made on behalf of evolution that have maybe been incompatible with the faith. But pretty early on, there were a number of subsequent, like serious Catholic thinkers who were willing to try to take serious how to reconcile them. So I would say like the Thomistic Evolution Project is doing that in the 21st century, still engaging with some of these objections, both scriptural, theological, as well as philosophical objections. And my main contributions have been focusing more on the philosophical topics.
Wonderful. So on that topic of the compatibility, I think it's interesting that Catholics initially did not seem to have a real big objection to evolution. And I think that itself speaks to a certain way of viewing the relationship between faith and science. Can you speak a little bit to generally how does a Catholic approach to the autonomy of the sciences and the compatibility of faith and reason fit into this topic in general with science and faith, and then a little bit more particular with evolution?
Yeah, so I mean, the Thomistic Evolution Project is focused a lot on the thought of Thomas Aquinas, his particular conception of the relationship of theology and philosophy, of faith and reason. And the conception is one in which faith and revelation perfect what God has given us naturally in terms of our abilities for reason. And so the idea is that what theology reveals are both things that could be known by philosophical and other kinds of rational inquiry apart from revelation, but also it discloses things that we couldn't know, like the incarnation or the Trinity. So there are these doctrines of faith that are accessible via reason, but are quite difficult to articulate and make clear apart from revelation. So the Thomistic Evolution Project draws on the thought of Thomas Aquinas to apply his views about the relationship of reason and faith, of philosophy and the sciences and theology, to try to articulate in the 21st century a clear account of how Catholics are going to answer various questions, whether they be scientific, philosophical, or theological, in relationship to evolution. Aquinas' own view is that God endowed, created all human beings with certain capacities of reason by nature that allow us to arrive at certain truths, whether they be demonstrative or probable, about a range of different issues, whether they be ethics, views about what is nature, views about what are species, views about what are human beings. And what theology and revelation brings is both answers to some of those questions as well that could be known independently via rational inquiry, but it also discloses to us various truths that we wouldn't know apart from rationality, or apart from divine revelation, such as the incarnation and the Trinity, teachings of human salvation, the role of the sacraments and the church. And what Aquinas teaches is that grace and theology, they don't supplant, they're not in conflict with natural reason. Rather, they elevate it. So it's not like there's this conflict of you either have to go with the rational conclusions, the rational arguments, the rational theses, or go with the theses of faith and divine revelation. Rather, they are taken to be compatible, and what faith does is it actually enriches, it enables rationality to go further than what it would be able to do on its own. And Aquinas has great confidence in this because he thinks God is the first truth, all truths come from God, and God has disclosed these truths to us in two sorts of ways. There's the book of nature, which can be investigated through empirical and rational inquiry, and there's what is sometimes in this metaphor the book of Revelation, which God gives directly to us through the prophets and most especially through Christ, and then through the passing on of the traditions of the church. And so these two truths both come from the same truth itself, that is the divine truth, and they're not going to be incompatible with each other. And so part of the work of inquiry, both whether it be philosophical or scientific, or whether it be theological, is to work out how does this ultimately harmonize, and how do we respond to objections that say that these are in conflict or tension with each other.
Great. So then when it comes to the topic of evolution in particular, I think one of the pitfalls that many people fall into with their thinking about this question is that there's sort of an either or here, where either God did this or it happened through a natural process. How does Aquinas help us to reconcile this apparent conflict?
Yeah, so already Aquinas thinks that, and there were these conflicts in his own day about whether or not, are we taking away from the glory of God if we allow for creatures to have natural processes, for creatures to perform things on their own powers, or are we somehow diminishing the creation if we take that away from them? And Aquinas' view is trying to reconcile both. We need to distinguish what secondary causes or creatures do according to their own created powers. And part of the glory of God is that he created these beings, that trees can carry out photosynthesis, that humans can exercise free will in their intellect. This is what their natural powers are, and it would kind of diminish creation if God couldn't actually give them these legitimate powers. So creatures do the creaturely things according to their created natures. But being creatures, they are utterly dependent for their being, their existence, their nature on God. And so God occupies the role of creator, and no creature can act as a creator. So part of what Aquinas provides is a framework for reconciling the harmony of these two. Don't ascribe to God the creaturely activity of like photosynthesizing like a tree. That's what the creator does. But likewise, the creature can't perform the role of the creator, which is bringing itself into existence out of nothing, sustaining itself in its being, sustaining itself in its nature. That's the kind of role that God plays. So Aquinas already has this framework engaged in the debates of his own day against occasionalism, which is a sort of view that takes it that creatures don't really have the power to make fire. They might just get in the right sort of situation, get the flame and get the wood kind of in proximity, and that provides the occasion for God actually to cause the wood to catch fire. That's not Aquinas' view. The creatures really have the legitimate powers and the causal efficacy to do the things that he created them to be able to do. Yet those created natures utterly depend upon him for their very existence, their natures, and their powers.
Sure. So when we talk about secondary causes, one objection that sometimes comes up is this sounds a little bit like deism, right? Mm-hmm. Where if you have the incorrect view here, you could think of God as sort of, maybe hitting the first pool ball at the Big Bang, and then everything else is unfolding and God is sort of hands off. So how is deism different from the Catholic approach here that Aquinas is articulating?
Yeah, good. So for Aquinas' approach, one is that there's these technical debates, and sometimes there's a view of called existential inertia, that once something comes into being, comes into existence, it doesn't go out of existence. Aquinas' particular view is that the way in which creatures come into existence, their very existence, which characterizes every aspect of them insofar as it is existing. And Aquinas' view is that existence can only be sustained through God's continuous causal efficacy. So the secondary causes are only active. They're only actualized, they're only existing, they're only exercising their powers actually, because there's always the primary cause of the creator that's sustaining them in their existence. So Thomism balances and tries to reconcile an account of both the transcendence of the deity, that God is absolutely transcendent to all of creation. All of creation is created, God alone is uncreated. So that captures the way in which God is utterly transcendent from all of creation. But also because of this absolute dependency for all creation, that there isn't existential inertia, that creatures always rely upon God for the sustaining them in their existence and their natures, that God is also in that sense immanent to all of creatures. So there's a way of capturing what's correct about deism, of the sort of transcendence of God to creatures, but also capturing something of maybe you might call pantheism or panentheism, that somehow the deity has to be immanent and has to be really close, but rejecting the errors of both of them, that deism places God at a distance, and pantheism and panentheism sort of confuse God with the creation itself. Aquinas is able to reconcile the truth of the immanence and the transcendence while avoiding both of the errors of the other views.
The Catholic both and.
That's right, yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Let's switch gears now. I really want to hear about your work in hylomorphism and neuroscience. So tell me a little bit about what you've been doing in that area.
Yeah, sure. So one of them is trying to situate debates that are engaged in different kinds of inquiry, but are complementary, and maybe trying to target where like the baton handoff occurs exactly. So hylomorphism is interested in a general natural philosophy or ontology of what are physical things, how are they composed, and the hylomorphic view is that all physical things in their natures are constituted or composed of two explanatory principles, their form and their matter. Their form is what makes them to be what they are. It makes them intelligible to us. It shows us what powers they're going to have and how those powers are going to be exercised in stereotypical ways with other kinds of natures. So the way in which water brought into contact with heat is going to characteristically boil at certain sort of contexts, and it is going to freeze in other sorts of contexts. So it's a view about the way in which form brings about structure, organization, a dynamic organization of the material components of something to make it to be what it is. The form is considered the act principle, and the matter is the potency principle. And some matter can be in potency to receiving other forms. And so you can have, a water that is somehow corrupted, and it becomes hydrogen and oxygen instead. But the matter there is what was in potency to receive through displacement other kinds of forms, namely the form of hydrogen and the form of oxygen. So there's a lot more to be said about hylomorphism, and you could go to the Thomistic evolution website or some of the Aquinas 101 videos to get more details on those aspects. So that's the kind of basic view about the project of hylomorphism is to try to articulate and defend this view against different sort of views about how human beings, animals, plants, and other inanimate objects are composed and constituted in their powers. I work primarily in philosophy of neuroscience. So I was interested in philosophers of neuroscience who were looking at explanations and accounts of what exactly neuroscientists do. And one of the areas that I focused on was what's called the new mechanist approach in the philosophy of biology, but especially in the philosophy of neuroscience. And this is an interesting area for about the last 20 years now has become kind of the dominant view in the philosophy of neuroscience. And it focuses on the way in which the mechanisms that scientists uncover aren't like old school post-Enlightenment mechanisms. These mechanisms are irreducible, they're hierarchically ordered, they involve organization of components and the way in which those components in their organization can exercise their causal powers with respect to each other and bring about some phenomenon. So like an action potential, the way that an action potential occurs in a neuron only can occur because a neuron is organized in a certain kind of way, that its dendrites are related to certain synapses receiving neurotransmitters from some antecedent neurons, axon helix. And if you don't have the right kind of organization of the components, you don't get the phenomenon of an action potential. And they look at that both at the level of organelles to cells, looking up to cell systems, so just sort of small neural assemblies that you might find like in the hippocampus, the like in the entorhinal cortex, excuse me, up to the way in like a systems level of neuroscience, so looking at the medial temporal lobe and how that's related maybe to the parietal lobe or areas like that, and then looking at like what's the rodent doing in the Morris-Waterton maze? How exactly is it doing the kind of things that it's doing there? And how, if you have an intervention at the top level, that might affect things all the way down at the organelle or cellular level. But if you have like an intervention, if you're doing like optogenetics or you're lesioning some of these neurons that are in the medial temporal lobe, how might that affect the way in which the rodent performs at the top level behaviorally in a Morris-Waterton maze? So one of the things that's interesting about the new mechanism approach is the focus on organization and components and their causal interaction. And it's a very irreducible, hierarchical, sort of structured approach. And what it really provides is a detailed model that fills out the kind of matter-form compositions that a hylomorphist is interested in at a more general metaphysical level. And it provides one of these areas in the sciences where they're not so worried about irreducibility anymore. They're more focused on a lot of ways in which these complex systems matter. It's not just the components, but it's the way that they all get organized together. So the new mechanists provided a pretty helpful way of, I think, filling out the kind of scientific details with respect to neuroscience that I think a Thomist should be interested in, but they're not going to be necessarily in the business of working all out those details themselves. This is a way of like looking at this literature that's not just about neuroscience, but is also about just biology and microbiology in particular, to enrich the hylomorphic model of looking at organisms and particularly looking at their organs and how those powers are related.
Great. Kind of an aside, are you familiar with Bernard Lonergan?
Oh, of course.
So how does this connect up with generalized emergent probabilities in Lonergan?
Good.
It seems like they're really related, right? Where you have some things, like you were saying, that at the smaller level, right, if you take these neural systems, they're ultimately comprised of atoms that are following these Newtonian laws and their physics and everything, and the quantum laws as well. And yet, like you said, there's a lot of things that happen at these higher levels that are not possible at the lower levels. Although the higher levels necessarily are built upon and contain the lower levels as well.
Yeah, so Lonergan provides a really rich, detailed account of this in the sort of middle to, I don't know, 2/3 in the way of his massive work Insight. And Lonergan has a pretty good account of how there can be this hylomorphic model of levels that are interacting with each other, but how certain levels, before a subsequent level emerges from lower levels, those levels are going to have certain kind of classical ways in which they necessarily interact with certain components or powers are going to be interacting systematically. But there's also this whole space that Aristotle, in Book 2 of his Physics, just leaves up to the area of chance. And Aristotle's conception of chance isn't like chance is a genuine causal factor. Rather, chance always presupposes this teleology of this convergence, where you have something acting for an end and another thing acting for an end, and they happen to converge, and so something interesting happens, some chance event, but neither of the two entities were intending. Their teleology was directed towards independent ends, and they just sort of converged. What had to wait a long time to develop was probability theory and an account of statistics, and so Lonergan's trying to reconcile both these ways in which there's classical interactions, but classical interactions leave room for the convergence of the statistics and the probability of the likelihood of some things occurring. And what that brings out is that some things are more likely to occur given these components and their systems of interaction. There'll be chance, but some things have a greater probability of occurring. And Lonergan wants to talk about the shift from just mere possibility that they might occur to greater probability, and then the likelihood that there's greater probability eventually, given the probability, they will occur. It's just a matter of time. And so you will have these convergences where what emerge from emergent probabilities are new levels where there's a new kind of integration of the system. And higher level systems can't function without the material components that make them up. So whenever, if electrons didn't behave the way electrons behave, I couldn't have action potentials in my neurons. And if action potentials in my neurons didn't occur, well, then these neural systems couldn't function in the way that they do. And if they didn't occur in the way they did, I couldn't carry out my activities of remembering and doing my best to try to remember my neuroanatomy and trying to summarize some of this new mechanism stuff with you. And so what Lonergan's approach, I mean, it's way more detailed than I've attempted to give a digest of here, is trying to give an account for how these higher level systems are always reliant upon the powers of the lower level, but yet they add something new and they sometimes constrain the roles in which the lower powers are now operative and activating. And this has become, quite bread and butter for more recent work in the emergence in sciences. So Carl Goulet's work on scientific emergence, he focuses on what he calls macretic determinations, and that's the way in which the whole constrains and influences differentially the way the component powers manifest. And this is just standard sort of hylomorphism, just rediscovered by people working in the metaphysics and the science of emergence. So there's a lot of these interesting factors in the last 3 decades that are sort of coming together and rediscovering things that hylomorphists have known for a long time. But I also have to say they've enriched it with a scientific literature that hylomorphists weren't particularly engaged in, perhaps with the exception of Lonergan and a few other people, even like 50 or 60, 70 years ago.
Wow, that's fascinating. Welcome back. We're on part 2 of our interview with Dr. Daniel de Haan at Oxford. And we were talking before the break about Lonergan a little bit and this idea that sometimes people have as an objection against evolution, that you can't have something more complex and something greater come from something lower and something simpler. So this is an area that you're working in, so tell us a little bit about your views on this topic.
Yeah. So one of the ways in which I think this principle is often called the principle of proportionate causality, and you have Aquinas appeal to some version of it all over the place in his works, and many other Aristotelian thinkers do. And some people think this is a kind of like internal philosophical objection as to why Thomism would be like incompatible with evolution itself. And myself and others, Brian Carl and others have written some exegetical studies to show kind of the details of how Aquinas is understanding this in terms of his own 13th century science, and why a lot of these objections are kind of misunderstanding actually Thomas's own view. Some of what I worked on is just looking at the kind of philosophical principles themselves and trying to resolve the problem and showing that there's not an incompatibility here in terms of the theory and how it relates hylomorphism to evolution. So one of the problems is that Thomists tend to already they focus so much on the hylomorphism of like an individual substance, how it's composed of form and matter, what kind of powers it has, but they often forget that these powers and these substances are always interacting with other substances. So just think of like something like gravity and the mass and the kind of powers associated with that. These are powers that are always on. They're always interacting with everything else. And there's a range of inanimate, vegetative, and sensory powers that we have. They're constantly always active, and they're always interacting with other substances. So hylomorphous Aristotelian Thomists need to think more about the systems of substances and how they're constantly interacting. And there are some ways that they're interacting necessarily according to their nature, but going back to the Lonergan point about emergent probability and just this convergence. Some convergences are incidental and they basically only ever happen once and they never happen again. There's not anything significant about them. But there are other kinds of convergences to which statistics and probability show you that they're likely to occur more and more. One of the things about getting correct this view about the systems of hylomorphic powers and substances is to recognize that it's really rare that you ever have an event that occurs, a causal interaction, which is one substance and another substance. It's often the case that you have many substances that are converging in a nexus and they're all contributing their powers. Now, the principle of proportionate causality is often thinking of things in a very simple way, as if there's just one kind of agent and it's basically producing some sort of offspring. So you almost have this like biological conception of how even like inanimate things come into being, as if like, one element comes from another element, almost like they're given birth by another element, but that's not really how it happens. I mean, according to most theories, most of the major elements that we have come from the collisions of stars of various kinds. So it's some sort of like two neutron stars that like merge or explode together. That's how you generate a lot of the heavy metals. That's how things like gold and things like that come to being. And if you think about what's occurring there, it's incredible number of substances and their powers that are all interacting at once within a system, and they're generating this polyphony of a range of different kinds of heavier metals and things of that, other kinds of elements. Any one of those substances, in some sense ontologically, is maybe less perfect than the substance that's generated. If you would think like somehow like water maybe is more perfect than hydrogen or oxygen, then you're not going to be able to, if you understood this principle of proportionate causality in this one way, you're not even going to get things like oxygen or water that come into being in the universe, because they're coming from less perfect elements or less perfect molecules. And so this understanding of this principle wouldn't just be a problem for how we think about evolution. It'd be a problem for like basic chemistry, basic physics. You wouldn't have any of the kind of substances. So it wouldn't just be a knock against evolution. It would have like effects that really spun out of control and did deep harm to the natural philosophy and the possibility of compatibility of Thomism with the sciences. But the thing is, we don't need to understand it in this way. And I call this interpretation of the principle of proportionate causality the ontologically superior account, that you have to have some ontologically superior substance that is causing the existence of other kinds of substances. And it wouldn't work for basic elements and inanimate objects, but it also wouldn't even work for Aquinas' biology, because he thinks the gametes, they're less perfect than the substances that generate them, but those gametes themselves aren't as perfect as the substances that they bring into being. And so you would have these imperfect entities. They're not even properly substances. They're like seminal seeds. They're principles of a substance. They don't even yet have the ontological superiority required for bringing about the offspring. So there's ways in which this principle clearly can't be how Aquinas is understanding it, even in his own sort of biological examples, but it would like wreak havoc across a different range of areas. So what I say is the proper understanding of this principle is, I call the sufficiently powerful conception of it. And the sufficiently powerful conception means that you just have to have enough of the right substances around which are capable of educing, this is Aquinas' technical term for how a substance is generated, they're educed from the potentialities of the nexus of substances involved. And so all the substances around have to have within them the potency, the proximate potencies for bringing about some new substance. And it might be in some sense ontologically a superior substance, but they're going to have the potentiality for that if you have the right causal nexus of all the powers interacting and working together. And so this often occurs in what Aquinas calls univocal causation, where the agents are working together and they're generating something that's like themselves. But there's also the case that there can be this convergent incidentally, where they're producing something that in some ways is different than them. And Aquinas calls this a kind of equivocal causation, where the agents are working together to generate something equivocal. And he thinks cases like the mule is like an example along these lines. Now, this relates in some ways to Aquinas' views about why, and Catholic views in general, about why the human person can't be generated solely by secondary causes, by creatures. Why does God have to provide, as a kind of order of nature, the human soul? And this is because Aquinas contends that the human soul has a special sort of dignity due to its immateriality. It's a strictly immaterial substance, or principle of a substance, a subsisting principle. And there can't be, in the physical hylomorphic cosmos that we exist in, it has the potentiality for educing any kind of form matter composed substance. But the human soul is not in of itself a form matter constituted substance. It is simply the form. It is an immaterial form. And so you can't have within the physical cosmos a potentiality for generating something that's wholly immaterial. It takes something like God to create it directly, because there's no potentiality for it to be educed. Now, one of the problems with this ontologically superior interpretation of the principle of proportionate causality is it basically makes every kind of substance function sort of like the way every sort of new substance that doesn't already exist, whether it be gold in the universe, whether it be a human being, or even a cow embryo coming to being from its gametes. It would make it so that the creation in the cosmos doesn't have the power to bring about these natural substances, and they would all have to be directly created, these new species, whether they be animate or animate, by God. But Aquinas has already a rationale for why it's only the human that has to be that, and that's because these rational souls are immaterial. There can't be potency for an immaterial form within the physical cosmos of form and matter. But there should be the potency and the powers naturally to bring about any one of these properly hylomorphic species, things like gold, things like cow embryos, things like new species that haven't yet existed, but the organism's convergence. And so one of the criticisms that I have against this particular ontologically superior account is they have no principled rationale for why the cosmos shouldn't have the potency for these new species to be adduced. That it's basically treating these species as if they're like rational souls, but they're not ontologically immaterial like the rational souls. So those are some of the arguments and sort of the criticisms that I've had of this ontologically superior, that they're not compatible with Aquinas' own view. They would wreak havoc on how we understood inanimate substances and how they're generated. It would also create problems for Aquinas' own view about how gametes can come together and create a new substance, which is not, they're not ontologically superior to that. And that if we adopt instead this sufficiently powerful construal of this principle of proportionate causality, we maintain the principle, but we also start to appreciate the way in which there's systems of hylomorphic substances that work together, and that the whole cosmos has the potency for getting the right kind of proximate powers ratcheted up, something through like emergent probability, like Lonergan describes, so that you can actually generate these new substances within the created cosmos as God has providentially ordered it to be the case, that they come about, but that there really is the powers within the cosmos to generate this, because there is the potency within the cosmos for them. Anyway.
Now, if we think about this with, as you were mentioning, the gametes and the offspring that are produced, and if we just start with the example of how we currently know human beings come into existence right now today. If you have the sperm and an egg, and they fuse, and you have all of the material there, naturally present through material causes that we can describe through embryology, and God infuses a soul, an immaterial soul, and you have the human being. How can we connect this understanding with the origin of the first human being? So similarly, you have a natural order, you have a material process that we can describe, and you can account for it with, if you want to stay just within material causes for now, completely within that realm, up to the point of, having these two non-persons who are the parents of the first human rational being, right? And they contribute the gametes, they fuse, and can we have an explanation that is material, compatible with evolution, and does not need an external sort of miraculous, occasionalist intervention by God, where God can infuse a rational soul in the first Adam, let's call the first man Adam, obviously. Mm-hmm. So is there a problem with this view of things, or do we see this as sort of, well, this is how human beings come into existence now, this is how Adam could have also come into existence?
Yeah, so I think that the Thomist line has to be that if this is properly human, part of the reason in virtue of which it's properly human is that it has these immaterial powers that of intellect and will that are transformative of how all of our sentient capacities and powers are exercised. So whenever you have a legitimate, genuine human, what's sometimes called like a philosophical human, so one thing to step back is that in the debate in the literature, they often want to distinguish between a kind of biological conception of the species, which is something that's going to be settled through empirical experiment or scientific means. You have a philosophical concept of a human, and then you have a theological concept of the human. And you might think that the philosophical and theological are going to come together. There's a grace that's perfecting and enriching what that philosophical conception is. So what matters for the scientific one is going to be something like a population of hominins that can interbreed, or there might be, as you know, there are rival conceptions of how we want to define a biological species. One of the things that I think actually a Thomist account can try to do is say, we can reconcile these alternative scientific empirical concepts of species because they're often tracking different things. Some of them are tracking interbreeding populations. You might have some more phylogenetic conceptions that are looking at slightly different relational factors. You might have some that are looking more at genetics, which maybe are related to like the source of these interbreeding populations. You might have some more fancy niche ones like ecological niche conceptions of what a species is, that this is where they live and this is where they thrive. What a Thomist wants to say is that none of those are quite capturing the ontological concept of a hylomorphic substance of a species. What rather they're capturing are the different kinds of propria, the different kinds of technical properties that a substance has. So a substance is going to have, like a human substance, is going to have properties for reproduction. And those powers for reproduction are going to have to do with a lot of things concerned with like sex selection and the way in which this population can be actually have mutual fecundity, that they can actually reproduce with each other. What a Thomist is going to say is these different scientific concepts of species aren't tracking the hylomorphic substance concept. They're tracking different powers, different propria, different properties. And it turns out that these properties can change a lot, and that's what scientific evolution is tracking for one and the same hylomorphic species. So hylomorphous Thomists are going to look at different kinds of concepts of species. It's going to take a lot of changes in evolutionary species to get to a change in the actual hylomorphic species, to go from some homonym species that's not human to the human case. Now the human case is complicated for a lot of technical reasons. So going back to your question now, what the hylomorphist is going to say is that at the level of propria, at the level of these technical properties that the scientific concept of a human is tracking, they're going to have a commonality there long before. They're going to have a shared set of these evolved propria, all belonging to one pre-human, from a philosophical point of view, hylomorphic species. And what's going to happen is that hylomorphic species is going to have within that population some of them that have newer developmental propria but are still capable of interbreeding. But some of them are also going to have more advanced sensory powers, some more advanced cognitive sentient powers that are still embodied in the nervous system. So these aren't yet immaterial powers. But they're going to reach a state at which their neural system is so complex, and they're not just their biology, but even their social patterns are so complicated that which is going to be related to the development and the really ratcheting up what you can get out of the nervous system by having these more complex social educational patterns. But you're going to have populations of homonyms that are actually capable of receiving a rational soul, but yet haven't yet. And whenever that does happen, it's going to be through the convergence of providence and God, actually now creating some offspring that aren't just the fusion of gametes and it's just this pure hylomorphic story, but they're ones that actually are endowed with rational powers in these offspring, in these embryos, such that he's going to have infused rational souls just like he would have in any one of us. So there's going to be the continuity of the story that you're really not going to tell any differences from the biological factor. All the things that the scientific account of species are tracking, the proprium, they're going to look basically the same from a hylomorphic point of view. What's going to change is that it's going to have a rational soul with these rational powers, and they're going to transform the way in which the sensory and vegetative powers are operating, but they're still going to be basically from an interaction point of view the same powers as the biological homonyms that they came from. So there's a lot more details that we'd have to go in through, and some hand waving there. But
sure, maybe just one quick sort of potential problem with this view, and I'd like to see how you respond to it. So in this view, correct me if I'm wrong, but you could have materially everything there that's the same, but immaterially not having a soul. By that, if that's correct, then would it be possible to have for example, some human embryos right now today that materially would have everything that's the same as what other members of our species have, but would have an immaterial soul. You can see how this would create problems then, right?
Yeah, so one of the thought would be is that they're not going to be exactly the same materially, because on the hylomorphic model, the kind of powers that you have are in virtue of whatever kind of soul you have, whatever sort of substantial form. So the pre-human homonyms are going to have some sort of really advanced hominin sensitive soul. And that's going to cascade in all the kind of powers they have. And the human is going to, the proper human is going to actually technically have different powers. The point is that they can still interact to a certain level. And so you're still going to have reproduction that's going to be possible within this population, things like that. So,
are you familiar with Ken Kemp?
oh yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm using some of his ideas or some of his concepts.
That's great. I interviewed him like a month ago.
Yeah, so this is developing some of the same lines and some of the same ideas that he has, as well as some of the developments by Travis Dumsday and some others who've elaborated some of Kemp's work on this. So, to address your difficult question, the thought would be is that, at a certain point in time, these other hominin populations have all gone extinct, and generally speaking, what they're going to reproduce is going to be the same species as this. So it might be the case that you could have humans that evolved, the current contemporary humans evolved to some other future kind of humans, but you'd have to have some further argument for what would be the case for why there wouldn't be something that's generating something still with a rational soul. And part of the view that I have here is that I with some distance actually to Aquinas' view, because he has this delayed hominization account where you have a sensitive organism and then that kind of generates into a vegetative organism as an embryo that then generates into a sentient organism and then generates into a rational organism. One of the things that is problematic here is even Aquinas' own metaphysics is, I think, at odds with this. So it kind of goes back to some of the things we were saying earlier. It's true that you need some proximate potency in order to adduce the sort of substantial form of a new substance in it. But the powers that are in the antecedent substance are not going to be, it's not the same organism, it's not the same parts anymore. It's completely transformed by the new substantial form. And so it's kind of a strange picture that that the way to get the sufficiently complicated brain is by having all these prior organisms, because the new substantial form is going to be that which grounds all these powers anyway. And so it doesn't make sense to delay the process over this long period within a single organism. For one, it's not particularly clear if it is the same organism anymore, so that's going to be some weird problems about individuation and identity. But two, if those sentient things aren't themselves capable of actually producing this sufficiently complex nervous system, how are they able to actually do it in this way that's appropriately fitting for this new rational soul? So it just makes more sense to have from the outset that you already have a sufficiently complicated organism in terms of what the gametes are capable of producing, but from the outset, God infused it with the rational soul so that its development and its identity continues on in the same sort of way. So you'd have to give some, I think, more complicated set of arguments and objections to say, why would it be the case that humans now would produce gametes that would be inferior in terms of the hominin species that they are? By now we've had thousands and thousands of years of just the human species that we have. The kind of biological thing that it's going to be producing is, from a hylomorphic point of view, going to be the same hylomorphic species. And even if you have like minor variations that scientists might start to think are, there's differences in the species that we are now, although I don't think anyone thinks that. They think that you'd have to have a lot more time to start getting, from a biological point of view, a new human species. It would still be the same hylomorphic species, and so its offspring are still going to be the same sort of hylomorphic species, even if you have these variation in their parts that are appropriate.
Sure, so like if we colonize Mars and we're separated for a million years.
Yeah, so you'd have to first, there wouldn't even be that would be just reproductive isolation, right?
Yeah.
You'd have to have reproductive isolation for thousands and thousands of years. And then it's not even clear if you actually have proper genetic isolation, right? Where you might just have it that the sex selection, everything, the people on Mars become way more attractive and they don't want to interbreed with the human population or something like that. They might still in principle be capable of interbreeding. It's just due to superficial reasons that they're not actually breeding.
But if you go long enough, you get some kind of genetic drift.
Exactly. So if you have long enough genetic drift, that then they actually become in principle incapable of interbreeding. Then you would have a case that they've probably become different biological species. but they might still nevertheless be the same hylomorphic species. It takes a lot more factors to make them a new human species than just that. There would have to be some other factors in their transformations. But you would also have to have a further argument for why they've ceased to be rational in some way, and so they don't have rational powers, and so they're not actually providentially, bringing about more human kinds of things, but they've somehow de-evolved. And I'd have to hear the further argument for why we should think that. But just because of disabilities or these sort of factors, that's not the kind of issue that really affects whether or not you can receive a rational soul, because the disabilities are something that are features of the parts or features of the properties. They're not features of the hylomorphic species, the hylomorphic substance. So that's going to be the same independently with how the manifestation of the parts. It's what grounds the parts, it grounds the powers, but the disability itself emerges through how the convergence of the interaction of these parts and those powers. So being the same kind of species, the same sort of human, that's already something that's upstream from these sometimes unfortunate effects of downstream effects of how the powers converge and lead to types of disabilities. So I hope that there's more to your very difficult question, but I hope that addresses some of the issues.
It does, and I think this might be a good place for us to stop. And we've gotten into a lot of great philosophical questions, and I was mentioning during the break the quote by John Henry Newman, 10,000 difficulties do not make one doubt. Mm-hmm. And I think we got a lot of great complex philosophy that I'm definitely not capable of giving as a scientist. And do you have any last words for the viewers about how a Catholic ought to approach, or maybe a scientist who is open to the faith? How ought we to approach this relationship of faith and science, especially when we have so many super complex topics and questions?
Yeah, so I think that the Newman quote's nice. I mean, Newman's also points out in his views about education something that's quite Aristotelian and in line with what Aquinas thinks as well, and which is so clear today, is that our inquiries have to be highly distributed. Just take the references of the bibliography, the citations, they show you how much we rely upon the work of others and how collaborative the process of intellectual inquiry and the pursuit of wisdom and truth are. And so one thing, going back to this point about Thomas, that God is the first truth, and God has revealed to us these two books, the book of nature, and those truths conform to and are compatible in harmony with the truths of the book of Revelation. I think we have great confidence in trying to arrive at a unified view about the truth from the sciences, from philosophy, and also from our faith in the revelation and the theological systematic reflections on that. And that, I myself started off as a kind of evangelical Protestant growing up, and I had, for no real deep reasons, other just sort of sincere but somewhat prejudicial views against evolution, and really hadn't done any sort of serious work both in the history of the theology and its reception, nor in thinking through the complexity of the different views about evolution, distinguishing actual complex theories from the different sorts of philosophical ideologies that have spun out in relationship to evolution. And I think, looking seriously at what the Catholic tradition has said, it's always been quite optimistic and hopeful and encouraging in how the collaboration of the sciences, the collaboration with philosophy and theology, the unity of faith and reason, the fides et ratio of John Paul II, that we can really quite have the courage to aspire to unite and find the way in which these are compatible, and to recognize that our philosophy and theology needs to engage in collaboration with scientific colleagues, just as scientific colleagues need to be open to being collaborative with philosophers and theologians, to try to get clear about the disciplinarity, complementarity, but also be clear and argue about where the boundaries are between the disciplines, for philosophers to be genuinely open to the correction and rectification from the scientists, but also for the scientists to be willing to be open to rectification and correction by some of the philosophers and theologians. And I think that that kind of optimism is a good thing to go into, and to recognize in your undergraduate studies that you might be really focused on some area in biology or chemistry and be sort of ignoring these areas in the humanities. But those areas in the humanities are actually going to deeply enrich your future ways of reflecting on scientific inquiries. But also you can have a very narrow-minded way of doing philosophy and theology where you're basically ignoring the sciences and the maths and depriving yourselves of a lot of tools and skills that you might regret that you have deprived yourselves of those, like speaking from my own experience. A few decades later, when you are surprised to discover now you're in the midst of this and you have to play a serious amount of catch up, and you could have had a much better reflection on how to engage in these collaborative inquiries because you weren't so narrow-mindedly, doggedly focused as an undergrad.
Well, I think you're doing a great job of modeling this integration, and hopefully our conversation will help others to
Yeah, sure.
also integrate as well. So thank you for being with me,
All right, thank
Dr.
you so much for
Haan.
the opportunity.